So good evening, everyone. I'm Andrew Schneider. I'm president of Logan Square Preservation. I'm one of the co-authors of the Arcadia book, Images in America, Logan Square. I'm joined here by my co-author, Jacob Kaplan. He is with Forgotten Chicago. And tonight we have a couple of people choking through the wildfires in, our other two co-authors are choking through the wildfires in California. That's Dan Pogozelski, also with Forgotten Chicago, and Ward Miller of Preservation Chicago.
They're fine, though. They're just in San Francisco.
Yeah, they're okay. They're just, coughing loudly.
Yeah.
Yes, in any case, so thanks for coming. I want to just open by telling you a little bit about what Logan Square Preservation does. I've been president for about 7 years, and we're a membership-based organization. We've been working in the neighborhood for about 40 years, nearly all at this point, and we help restore buildings. We help beautify the neighborhood, whether that's planting trees or cleaning graffiti or just picking up garbage. That's what a lot of the things that our volunteers do. We run the house walk. We're really well known for that. So, and then we do other special events. There's a lot of, there's a big social component to Logan Square Preservation. So if you're interested and you live in the neighborhood, you should really consider joining. If you do join, we have these nifty pins. They're celebrating 100 years of the Illinois Centennial Monument, which is, of course, the heart of Logan Square. There's also copies of our book in the back that are for sale at the end or presumably throughout. You can buy them from Anna in the back. In any case, so thanks for coming. I want to talk a little bit about, at this point, it's really funny, the book, 6 or 7 years ago, I wouldn't have thought there was enough material in existence to do a book on Logan Square. And now when we come and do events like this, I really struggle to figure out how to pare down all the information that's been gathered. But usually the story of Logan Square starts with the gentleman who lived in this house. This is Martin Kimball's house. He settled here in the 1830s. He had a 160-some-odd acre farm that was west of Kimball, which is named for him, though it was a spelling error, and their name was actually spelled with an E, something that the Kimball descendants to this day are resentful about. But the experience of a pioneerman like Martin Kimball was very unique. He spent a lot of time mostly cutting hay on his farm. That hay was essentially the oil of its day. So he would ship, at one point it grew to about 1,000 bushels a year of hay down to the city of Chicago to fuel the growing city's hunger for hay to fuel the horses, draft and otherwise. Kimball later got into business with another pioneer named William Powell, who settled down, George Powell, his son was William. George Powell, who settled at Milwaukee and Western and Armitage, and the two of them went into the gardening business as well. This photo is actually pretty famous. A lot of people have seen it before. It's been reproduced over and over again over the last 40, 50 years. But I like to pair it with this map. So the house that you can see, the house is actually right here. That's the Kimball house, the original house. This is Kimball here, and that's today that's Altgeld. So that gives you an idea of the geography of what was going on at the time. The Kimballs later developed, this is labeled as Ballow here, but it was later Smalley Court for the Kimballs' mother's maiden name, and the Kimballs had a hand in developing that. This is another one of the photos that appears in our books. What's interesting about it is even at this late stage, this is the 1906, 1907, 1908. You can see what we recognize in Logan Square. This is the looking south on Kimball, south of Altgeld. So this is, if we go back to the map, those buildings that you see are right here. They're located here. But on the other side, there's just nothing. In fact, you can see there's a little split rail fence here in the foreground. So if you spend as much time looking at these photos as I do, you'll start to pick out little details like that. You realize, gosh, what an interesting thing or at least what I think so. I'm not sure. Of course, you're all here, so presumably you find it interesting as well. And this is another view looking north, sort of on the Kimball farm area. So this was a photograph taken of what was then the First and Emmanuel Church, and it was a Danish church here at Wrightwood and Kimball. But there's a large Art Deco apartment building, if you know the neighborhood, that sits on this site today, and that was like a 1920s edition. But up to this point, for a long, long time, it was just a row of houses that were developed by the Kimballs. Does anybody know what this house is? Got any guesses? It's certainly long. Yes, it's demolished. This is in fact one of two places that are often referred to as the Powell House. This building stood up until the middle of the 20th century on Western Avenue, north of Milwaukee. So they had the Powells had a big tract of land, just like the Kimballs. And the Powells, they had a fruit garden, actually, an orchard on their property here on Western. But they also established the Powell House at Western and Milwaukee. And what's, of course, very important about the Powell House, it was one of several way stations along this early track, Milwaukee Avenue, which we know today, which is this famous and very highly trafficked road. Wasn't so at the time, and it was a sort of a ridge, if you will. This was a very marshy place in which we lived, and so the ridges were what people traversed on, but they would kind of wander. They weren't straight as an arrow, and so there was pressure building for the state to come out and actually survey a road and say there's going to be a road here, and so Powell was very concerned that his inn would not be sort of in the path of the road, that the road would sort of bypass his inn, and so he told the surveying party that was meeting down at Kinsey and Milwaukee that if they could, he struck a flag on his inn, and he said if they could hit that mark, they would get essentially all the free food and liquor that they could drink and eat, and so it runs straight as an arrow right to the old Powell House site. And anyway, so this is a little drawing of the Powell House. We have some photographs as well. This one obviously is damaged, but it's in the collection of the Art Institute. You can see where the damage is, but it's obviously, you pick up the tower and a lot of these other details. And here's another one sort of in spring that gives you an idea. And how out of place this must have been in the middle of the 20th century. As you can see car lots springing up around this house. The Powells were a little bit more prominent than people realize today. They owned land, a lot of land, just like the Kimbells did, and they also developed just like the Kimbells did. But the Kimbells have a road named after them, and the Powells don't anymore. But if you look here, just at the bottom left, you can see this is Powell Avenue, south of Clara Place, and so Clara was actually one of the Powells' daughters. It was in the line, But Powell Avenue was Campbell, so it was the first block west of Western was Powell Avenue. And it's actually remembered as being a particularly wealthy road. So in the early history of the development, the Powell Avenue is where all the nice houses were. You can see a few of them here. You got the Second Empire, big dormers, and just really nice big balloon frame construction. And the Powells, those living on Powell Avenue, even though they were a little better off, they had the same problems a lot of people did, which was when it rained, nobody could get down the road. It was too muddy. This site was also developed by the Powells. It's labeled here as Powell Park east of Powell Avenue. So,
yes.
Yeah, they really did not want to be forgotten, which is a shame. What's really kind of amazing about this, of course, is does anybody have any guess as to where this is? Well, they know Powell Avenue is Campbell. This is McLean today. So if you were to go down there, in fact, almost every one of these buildings is still there. It really deserves a landmark protection all its own. It's hard to recognize because sort of the most prominent one here, they've really mucked up the turret on the corner. So, but if you go over there, this building, it's on the side here. There's a side entrance, but you'll actually see Powell in big letters right on the building. And in fact, it's amazing to me occasionally. It took me a second when I first found this photograph to figure out what it was. But this building is on Western, and it's actually still there. So if you were to stand on this site, you'd get a very, very similar view. This is a parking lot for the Campbell Terrace Apartments today. And so it's a really oddly similar vista today as it was 100 years ago, 110 years ago. This is another very interesting story. I'm sure some of the people in the room have heard of Maplewood. Maplewood was one of many early settlements. So if anybody's driven through the country today, you know that these little towns kind of cluster and they grow up. And I've got family that live in the country, and it's kind of fun to see people in rural areas. One of my cousins had a farm, and then they all just have over the last 50 years just kept building houses near the other person's house on the farm, and that's kind of how this area developed. There was in the middle of the late 1800s up to 1870, there was no train service. There was no streetcar. It stopped further down closer to the city. So this was a very, very it was a farming area. And so one of the communities that was the Powells might be said to have lived in was Maplewood. But the boundaries of Maplewood, the biggest boundaries I've ever heard, were Milwaukee on the south, the Chicago River, Diversey, and Sacramento. But initially, that Sacramento boundary was a little far. Most of the time, it actually stopped at California. But this train station is on the Chicago Northwestern Railroad tracks, and it's located. Guys, everybody knows where the Green Exchange is and the old Ale Syndicate Brewery. This is essentially where this is. This is Diversey in the back here, And this is perched right up on the old Chicago Northwestern Railroad tracks. And so this station arrived in 1870. And that really sort of spurred the first phase of development in Maplewood. But what kind of blows my mind when I think about, like, I walk through Logan Square, I always try to, and by the way, I should mention, a lot of this lecture is going to focus on lost buildings that aren't here any longer. And we have retained so much of our historic housing stock and building stock, and yet even then, so it's hard to imagine. You walk down a street and you see a bunch of 100-plus-year-old buildings. It's like, well, that was obviously the only building ever built there. But we've actually lost quite a number, certainly of the early buildings, but certainly the Maplewood station's among them. I just found this actually 2 days ago when I started thinking about doing something on Maplewood. This appeared. This is actually a colorized photograph, so you can see how it fades away as it goes in the back, and you got a horse here in black and white, and you got some other buildings. I'm still working on figuring out where exactly this house was, but this is what you would have seen if you could imagine just a treeless prairie, all the way down to the Chicago River, and then you'd see a lot of these frame houses. The Maplewood section of Logan Square developed more quickly than the areas that were east of Western and south of North Avenue. Those areas after the fire in 1871. Anything that was inside city limits had to be built of brick, so that people who were living out here and farming, they all wanted to build outside the fire line, west of Western and north of North Avenue, and that way they could build it out of a cheaper wood frame construction instead of brick. So the wood frame homes that exist in Logan Square all date sort of between, or with some variability, they'll date between 1871 and 1889 when the area was incorporated to the city of Chicago. But we look at some of these wood frame buildings, and one of the big fights we have in Logan Square preservation is trying to get people to appreciate, yeah, you got a house with aluminum siding on it, and it's been really pared down, but it probably looked like this when it was first built. Maybe you should think about that as a historic building too. I added this photo in because I wanted to. I've been absolutely fascinated lately by wood frames. So this is the block of Logan. That's St. John Birchman's there. If everybody sort of kind of orient themselves with St. John Birchman's, so here's Rockwell coming in, and there's these 1, 2, 3 frames. There's now like a 6 flat in between these two, but these two frames, I'm sort of fascinated by them because this one today has a turret on it, and this one has a porch. So it was always, it's fascinating to me that this is an early 1900s photos, 1906, 1908, 1909, and yet people were still sort of within the period embellishing their frame houses. So I kind of keep puzzling out why that is. And if we go to the next photo, this is the next block over. So this is Rockwell, and if you were to turn, you sort of in time, sort of turn, pivot your head, this is the next block. So this house here, I think I can conclude with a fair amount of certainty, belonged to Mr. Hoffman. Mr. Hoffman built that house in 1870, and it was at the southwest corner of Logan and Rockwell. It may very well have been picked off its foundation and moved over in the 19-teens in order to facilitate the construction of a 10-flat. I'm very familiar with the building that sits next to it today, and it's just sort of, it's an odd puzzle, but these wood frame buildings fascinate me. This one's still there. It got added on to. They enclosed the front porch, but the building itself is still there, and it's a really delightful little building. This is the family. These photos all date from the 1890s. These two in particular are illustrative of the ways in which Logan Square preservation acquires historic material, which is sometimes from the most unusual places. A gentleman named William Brown owns these photographs. They're hanging in his house up in Highland Park, and he just posted them to our Facebook group one day out of the blue, and I emailed and started talking to him, and he says, well, you know what, that's my grandmother right there. And I said, well, she'd tell me a little bit about what happened here. He says, oh, well, we were all these Norwegians, and we came over here, and my great-great-grandfather owned this building, and he built this building for his children, so they moved in next door to this other building. And the little bit of history that maybe some people are aware in here is that Logan Boulevard and Kedzie Boulevard all used to be named Humboldt Boulevard. So everything this side of Humboldt Park was known as Humboldt Boulevard. So when you're reading a lot of these old photos that are labeled, it says, California and Humboldt, or Francisco and Humboldt, and you're kind of going, how do those two intersect? And the answer is that, of course, it's Logan. So this gentleman, I'm talking to him on the phone one Saturday because I'm, crazy that way, and he says to me, I was in the 80s. He says I would drive down the Kennedy Expressway with my grandmother, and she would say, we'd go across and we'd see St. John Birchman's, and she'd say, they call it Logan Boulevard today, but when I lived there, it was Humboldt Boulevard. And that's something that's so distant in the past. They changed that in 1911, 1912, that to sort of, I'm talking to this guy, and it kind of blows your mind a little bit to imagine, here's somebody who within living memory knew, he knew somebody that knew it as Humboldt Boulevard, which sort of, but the way this gets dated is the other thing that's fascinating. I love the group mind that exists online, because I posted this, and the guy said, it's at least 1890 is what Mr. Brown said, and I'm always skeptical. When people say 1890, that's an old photograph. And somebody then I posted online and said, I'm not quite sure about the date, sometime in the 1890s. And some guy goes, well, the flag's your giveaway. That was only flown for 1 year in 1891. He, of course, concluded that meant that it was definitely 1891. I think that perhaps the Norwegians, like the Norwegians I know at the Minishirken, are just a little thrifty and maybe didn't want to get rid of the flag. But, if you're listening, if anybody here from the Minishirken, I apologize. I put this photo in. This is 2649 Logan Boulevard, and I did this too to sort of, there's two things about this that are great. One, you've got this little caption, hey, Grandma, when you come back, stop at this house, right? It's their house. This was a medium that was used by professional photographers. It was also used by amateurs. This is obviously an amateur photograph, but what's great about it is just how empty. You get a little hint of, there's three graystone, 3 flats to the left or 2, and they're just not there yet. And it's kind of amazing to imagine to see Logan Boulevard get developed that way. Going back to Maplewood, this is all in Maplewood, which is why I grouped it together. But this is the Maplewood Opera House, of course, as labeled after the fire night of July 30th, 09. The Maplewood Opera House is one of those, we've lost and forgotten so much of the early history of the neighborhood. But Maplewood and the Maplewood Opera House is a big part of that. The Maplewood Opera House was, of course, well known to a young man named Newt Rockney, who spent a good amount of time there. But this was also a early public school. So the Chicago School Board in 1891 leased the entire first floor of the Maplewood Opera House for classrooms for overflow from the Libby School. The Libby School was basically more or less where Brentano is today. And but this was a huge center of community for Maplewood. It was close to the Northwestern train station at Rockwell and Diversey, and it's today the site of the Maplewood Opera House is actually in the expressway. So it's Rockwell and Schubert, which is an intersection, of course, that no longer exists. This is guys, everybody knows where Popeyes is on Diversey. And we've got today, now of course our ancestors had this, our forebears had this, we have Popeyes and the IHOP. Yeah. You're laughing, sure. Anyway, it's a beautiful building, but sort of it gives you a sense there was a real center of community life and commerce here. And of course, not only was there this building, which of course dentist offices and everything else on the upper floors. There was a movie theater across the street called the Maplewood Theater. But the Maplewood Theater came down in the 70s. That's where the Walgreens is today, was the Maplewood Theater. This is just another photograph as I was trying to illustrate the dirt roads and the kind of frame construction that you would have seen in this early period. These houses are actually both still there, but they were completely shorn of their details, and so I'm sure some developer is going to target them for demolition at some point. But so I want to take a minute here to sort of go back to the very early history. One of the things that amazes me is how history is conveyed to us today. So I've picked up bits and pieces. It feels almost like you're picking up from like the flotsam and jetsam of history, of time rather. But we actually, just last week, a young lady gave us a package of materials from a church called Fourth Congregational Church. And the Fourth Congregational Church, which is going to come up a little bit later in our talk, and actually I think it's probably the next slide, it existed at, here's our intersection again, right? Powell and Shakespeare, right? So Campbell and Shakespeare. And this church was formed from, it was really very disorganized in terms of its beginnings. There were like 4 or 5 different churches, and they were all trying to form within these farming communities, different congregational churches, and there were personalities involved. But we actually, as I realized in the last week, we owe them a great debt, because what happened to this church is, of course, very sad. It burned. And it burned in 1927. And when it burned, all the records of the church were lost. And so in 1927, the pastor went around and started talking to all the old-time members of the congregation to recreate and document the history of of the church. And in the course of doing that, now I've collected a lot of church programs and material over the years, but I'm always disappointed. We pulled, earlier this year, we pulled a time capsule out of Church of the Advent, and there was some really nice material in that time capsule, but I kept hoping it's an early congregation. Maybe they're going to give us some insight into what it was like to actually live there, and they gave us none of that. It was almost entirely, and such was the chorus door, and we borrowed the vestments from this church in Irving Park, and we did, and it was, it's great and all, it was important to the church. But the pastor who did this sort of oral history, he went around and talked to the earliest people who lived in the neighborhood. And he didn't just ask them about the formation of the church, he asked them what it was like to grow up in the neighborhood. And so it's this wonderful, marvelous detail where they talk about, he's breaking it down by decades, which I've never, 1850s. Here's 500 words on what it was like to live here in the 1850s, the 1860s, the 1870s. And he's talking about, we graded, the roads were all graded, and then they were ditched for drainage. And in the spring, there was enough water in the ditches to float a rowboat. And the ditches on Armitage were the deepest ditches, and they were all lined with willows. So we would, whenever we were down there, we had to compete with the mosquitoes. It was terrible. But that sort of living detail of what life was like is really, it's just amazing. And these are just more photos so these were all in the collection that we were donated in the last week, and I really was struck by it. And this is when I talk about sort of looking at an old building and going, that building's been there since time immemorial. Because, of course, for those of us, particularly those of us who are under 40, sure, it has been there since time immemorial. But the building that's on this site is an enormous multi-unit apartment building, which makes sense. It's built in the 20s. They were building a lot of these big courtyard-style buildings. But there's no hint as you go by that there was once this enormous, beautiful wood-frame church. This is another photograph this is the fire station at Fairfield University. I include this just to kind of give you guys a vista. If you look in the back, this is California. This house is on California. And there's no expressway. So it's always, for those of us who are familiar with the neighborhood, it's so strange to be able to look and see just no expressway. The train tracks are back there, but they weren't even raised. And here's some more early development. Fullerton actually still has many of our very early commercial structures. We've seen a lot of them get demolished in this most recent wave of development, which has been a real loss. In fact, the one at Rockwell and I think it's Rockwell and Fullerton, there were that collection of a couple of very old frame houses and a frame multi-unit or like frame commercial building, mixed-use building. It's really sad to see, particularly the old frames go. And here's another photo. This is, again, Maplewood, but this is Diversey. It's a little west of Maplewood, but it gives you an idea of when real estate speculators were starting to develop and market these lots, what you might have experienced going down Diversey. Now, of course, we can stop at Fat Rice right there today, but they didn't have it then. And I include this also to sort of show you these frames existed prior to St. John Birchman's. So St. John Birchman's once, where it's a block today there's the school and more school, that used to be the convent. But originally the church brought up that block. It was a series just like the other blocks of Rockwell and Logan, that area. It was part of that early community of Maplewood with a lot of old wood frame cottages. This is a great building. Anybody know where this is? Can you pick it out? This is St. Luke's Lutheran Church. It's the original St. Luke's. It's now New Community Church, but this church is now buried in the building. So this is facing Schubert, where Schubert used to go through. St. Luke's today is sitting in the middle of Schubert, but St. Luke's just kind of grew and grew and grew, and so this building is contained within the existing building. But if you go down the alley, or if you walk down Mozart, and you just sort of peek just right, you'll see this spire still standing back there. This is another interesting story. So, one of the really early areas of development was the area around what's the California Blue Line station today. That's where you get Bingham and Attrill and all these oddly named streets that don't go anywhere else but right there. And St. Sylvester's old church was originally on the site of the 14th District Police Station. And this is why I think when I mentioned earlier that frame house that I thought moved, they were always moving things. So this church was actually, they sold that to the city to allow the city to build the 14th District, and then they picked the church up and they rolled it over to the current site of St. Sylvester's, and then 10 years later they pushed it over for Brick Church. But it's I know, right? It's kind of fascinating. Actually, maybe Jacob can speak a little better to this one than I can.
Sure. So this is actually the former. This is the town hall, right? Yes, this is the town hall that actually is on the site of what is currently a firehouse right off of the California Blue Line station, just south of the tracks. So, of course, as you may be familiar, Logan Square was not always part of the city, or at least the area was not annexed until 1889. So prior to that, it was part of Jefferson Township. And just like other townships, many of which still exist throughout the state, it was pretty much a rural township in the early days, and then it grew. And so there was a need for township government. And so for many years, the Jefferson Township Hall was here at right off of California, right near the Blue Line. There were some other municipal buildings related to Jefferson Township farther north in the Six Corners Portage Park area at Cicero and Milwaukee, but a lot of the village or township government, I should say, was right there. And what's interesting is that even after it was annexed to the city in 1889, and this was part of the great annexation that was done prior to the 1893 World's Fair, where Chicago annexed massive amounts of land to make us the biggest city in the world. Not really. I mean, it's kind of a boosterish thing. We may have been the largest in land area. It's tough to say. And of course, New York shortly thereafter would annex Brooklyn, would become part of, and all the outer boroughs would become New York City. So, but in any event, that was part of the great annexation of 1889, and this building would be used as a firehouse for many years, and interestingly, it would continue to be, that site would stay in municipal use, and now, when the city built a new firehouse in the 1920s, they used the same site. So this particular site as a site for a municipal government building goes back to the, I think, 1850s at least. So it's interesting.
This is another fun puzzle that I unraveled about a month ago. This is St. Anne's Episcopal Church, which stood on the corner of Kimball and McLean. There was a rash of these problems, but this church actually burned twice. It burned once at the turn of the century and then once again in the 60s. And in the 60s, the Episcopal Church tried for about 3 years to raise money and reinvigorate the congregation, and then they just gave up. So I was totally unaware that this church existed until somebody asked me, hey, I was looking, and this people actually do exist like this. He goes, hey, I was looking at the old Sanborn fire insurance maps. And I was like, of course, of course. And he said, do you have any idea what this church is? And of course, I managed to dig out some records. But this is the only photo. I think this one is the only photo I actually know of it. And then I zipped ahead to the next phase of our forgotten parts of our neighborhood, which is Callahan's Ballpark in Logan Square. If anybody's ever heard of the Logan Squares, they're they were at one point a really famous team. They were led by, in 1906, they were led by a guy named Jim Nixie Callahan, who was sort of forced out of the White Sox. They called him the anarchist of baseball because he hired anybody. You could be suspended, you could be drunk, you could be a gambler, and this guy would hire you as long as you were good. And his team was so good that in 1906, the Cubs and the Sox both lost to the Logan Squares. In fact, Ty Cobb actually wrote Callahan about trying to come and play for the Logan Squares. So it was a real serious team. But the funny thing is, this land was all part of a homestead by the Butterfield family. And they rented it in 1905. Ada Sawyer Garrett, rented it to Jim Callahan for 20 years. And so it just sat there. If you can imagine how Logan Square boomed from 1905 to 1925, and right in the middle of what's this enormously complex, bustling commercial district, there's this enormous baseball field just sitting there. And by the 20s, it was just, they were hosting high school games. They weren't attracting 10,000 people anymore. But it's to get a sense of, to kind of orient yourself. Here's Milwaukee Avenue. This is the square. Our Norwegian church is here. And McDonald's is right about here today. And actually, that's the old Avondale School there. But this is where the baseball field was. And this gives you an idea. If you were walking down Milwaukee Avenue, this is what you would have seen. These big grandstands. Callahan actually did build the grandstands. And I love this photo. These real photo postcards are really stunning. So this is a 3-inch by 5-inch image. And if you scan it, it's first generation. So there's Callahan's Ballpark way at the end. And you can actually make out there's Callahan right there. And there's an ad for Riverview. It's kind of amazing just how good these photos are if you know where to look. So I wanted to move on to sort of give you an idea of what early Logan Square looked like. I don't know, anybody guess where this is looking? It's right. It's Logan Square. So that building is standing on the site of the northernmost L station, so at Kedzie and Milwaukee Avenue. So you've got no curbs, you got a couple of buildings here, but just grass and trees. It's kind of amazing. And this was early 1900s, so it wasn't like it wasn't 200 years ago. This is another early photograph of Logan Square before the Centennial Monument. But these buildings here are, to orient you, they're built on where the southernmost L station is on the site. And that's the Logan Square Norwegian Baptist Church, which is now a single-family house on Wrightwood. and that's a kid. It's funny. I also included this to kind of give you guys a sense. So we're at what was the Metropolitan Elevated Station, right at 2525 Kedzie, basically, and there was a platform there before the Logan Square Auditorium was in place. You could look out right over Logan Square, and so there's the Minishirkin under construction. This is where Webster's is. Those of us who imbibe too often. And then this is where the L station is today. But there's this marvelous letter from a guy named Thomas Dale who wrote to John Drury in 1950 that the square was just a flat place. So today it's elevated, you walk up to the monument. But at this time, it was just this quiet, level place. It was very busy with traffic and nobody could figure out where they were going. But in the summer evenings, the people in the neighborhood would come into right where that flag is there and they'd all listen to music. And then this is looking back, so to give you a sense, here's where the elevated terminal was, and then this is where they built the Logan Square Auditorium. The Logan Square Auditorium site was actually owned by a woman named Gilbert. So if you look at the Logan Square Auditorium, you'll see Gilbert up there. It was she entered into a 100-year land lease, which I guess technically would have expired in 2008 at the time. So a Greek family named Giannopoulos developed the Logan Square Auditorium. And then this is the elevated station itself. So we're going to go into a whole bunch of the elevated station. The arrival of the elevated in 1895 is really what spurred enormous growth in Logan Square. And it's what also sort of created a center at Logan Square. Prior to that, we talked about this center at Maplewood. There was another center up at the Avondale train station. So Logan Square itself was very sleepy up until about 1895. And that's when the arrival of the train brought in a ton of traffic. And that's when it started getting developed. This is just another sort of tight shot that shows you the Kedzie Boulevard looking towards the train station. I love this photo. This is an amateur photo, but it's clearly rush hour. If you can zoom in, which you can, look at all the people. It's kind of amazing. This little white speck here, this is a porter. That's a billiards facility, or hall, I suppose. And I include these photos to kind of, everybody knows where this elevated station is, right? It's the old Banco Popular or the Washington Park National Bank, the building there that's now faced in all plain brick. And the developers have now been proposing that in fact, Logan Square Preservation has been flyering, of course, this hideous building they want to construct. But one of the things we want to do is try and save, this is to kind of give you guys, a guy did this on Forgotten Chicago's Facebook page, and I just loved it because he took a view here and inserted what the station would look like today. But the station, this is looking down Linden, just to give you guys a sense of what sort of the size and the bustle and how much was going on in this station. These photos were all taken prior to its closure.
When was it closed?
It was closed when they extended the Blue Line out it closed finally in 1970. That's the auditorium building there. This was a train shop that was at the top that was sitting on top of where the bank is today. And so in 1968-69, the city of Chicago finally went forward with this plan to extend the Blue Line. I had this marvelous story from a Greek gentleman named Vasilopoulos. If anybody knows him, he used to own the Logan Theater. And so he said that they really wanted the city, to extend the subway down Milwaukee Avenue, because there was a rumor they had heard that the city was going to join up with the expressway at Rockwell. So they were going to run the elevated right up Rockwell and put it in the expressway right away over there. And so the Logan Square merchants were very upset. This was the core of their business, was people coming and going. And so he said we went downtown and we formed in part the Logan Square Neighborhood Association was energized out of this. And so they were fighting and they really wanted, and so the city comes back and says, well, what about we'll run an elevated down the alley, Milwaukee Avenue. We'll run it through Logan Square, an elevated train, and we'll put it right through the center of Logan Square. We'll move the monument out of the way, and we'll run it down the backs of your buildings. And so the theater owner complained. He goes, well, I can't have an elevated train going behind my movie. I'll lose my business. I won't do anything. And he says, I was convinced later that Mayor Daley was doing it. Old Mayor Daley was doing it just to get us riled up. He says, because we finally got a meeting with a guy, and we begged him. We wanted to beg him to do a subway. And he said, we showed up and we said, Mr. Daley, please, would you consider a subway? And he says, well, hold on a second. He says, went to another room and he came out with a complete set of blueprints for the Logan Square subway station. He goes, something like this? And they're like, but the next series of photographs are all kind of buildings that we lost and space that we lost as a result of this. So this is the Logan Square Theater. And this is where the Mega Mall parking lot used to be. But it's actually designed by Horatio Wilson, which is a noted architect. He did a lot of work down in Hyde Park, but some buildings in our neighborhood as well. There it is, getting demolished. In fact, if anybody uses Sparrow Salon, that's Sparrow in the background to give you guys a sense of orientation. Yep. This is another view. I bring this in to show you guys again how many great buildings we've lost. So this is Milwaukee Avenue. This is Reno here today. So this building is sitting where the L station is. This building is sitting where the L station is. That's Grace's Furniture there. To give you an idea of how riotous this is, if you look at this photo at scale, there's David up here, right, for David Storage, but there's a S there and a T there and an O, and so this sign would have flashed, David Storage, David Storage. And just to give you a sense of how you're sitting in the square, it would have been incredibly noisy. But this building here, this was Clarence Hatzfeld designed this building, and it was basically 6 stories tall, all white glazed brick, these big, beautiful sconce lights. Gives you an idea of what it would have looked like. And it was a car dealership, right? This was an early car dealership. Logan Square was a center of auto retailing for the whole Northwest side. It makes sense. People get off the L, and what are they going to do? They need to get in their car and drive home to Jefferson Park or one of the nice places. And here's the front door. So there's Lang Buick, and it's amazing because these curved glass windows, you can see that's actually Grace's Furniture there. So you see Milwaukee Avenue going north and Milwaukee Avenue going south. And I love the terracotta detailing with the you see the wheels above the door and the winged wheels. And that's the inside. So if you feel like, the Fox Ford Lincoln dealership is very nice, of course, but I think myself I might prefer shopping here. Here it is coming down. So that came down as part of the whole extension in 1969. And we also lost this whole collection of buildings. So this is a billiards and bowling facility here. That's the Logan Square Theater there. And this would have once formed the southern side of Logan Square, sort of the southern wall of our public space. And so today, this is the last building that's standing on Logan Square. This, the Food Queen, which is a marvelously named grocery store, that's actually a former theater there, the Victoria Theater, but which of course makes sense for a good adaptive reuse, 1960s adaptive reuse. But all of these buildings here were demolished for the L. And this is, you can start to see the scale of the excavations and what it must have been like as they were doing this work. There you can see the Logan Square Auditorium right there. And this is Logan Boulevard. There's the old bank building, and this is where New Wave Coffee and Play and all those are. The prescription drugs is where Reno is.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. And then you can see the construction move up Milwaukee. The merchants actually begged the city to tunnel. They said, please, please tunnel. You'll kill our business. And the city said, oh, no, we're going to finish the work in 3 months. It'll be no problem. They killed an enormous number of businesses on Milwaukee Avenue. And every time, just today I read a headline in Block Club Chicago about Belmont complaining bitterly, you can't shut us down through November and December. You're going to kill all our businesses. This is unreasonable. Of course, it seems that the city has never yet sort of learned that they should probably defer to some of these businesses.
More expensive to tunnel.
I don't know if it was. I don't know how much more expensive it was. I do know that the excavation was a very interesting process. If you go down to the Logan Square Blue Line Station today, you'll see evidence of what our substrate is really like. We're a swamp. We're a really marshy area, and so the Logan Square Blue Line Station, if you're down there, it's always dripping water. You see water tracks everywhere. So I understand, and you'll see in a lot of these pictures. I don't know if I pointed them out, but you'll see big pumps because they had to constantly pump water out of these excavations. And they also killed businesses like this in the end. The Terminal Restaurant was founded in 1911, and this is the train shop here, that's the auditorium there, and this was this really big-time business. It was a huge center of culture, and it was owned by a Greek gentleman who, I've actually talked to his sons who worked in the restaurant. It's kind of fun when you get a chance to talk to the people that remember, slinging hash. This is, it doesn't look like much, but I might have accidentally kicked a brick off the facade of the bank building as it sits today, and you can actually see there's a little bit of like rainbow granite right there. I believe that you can see this is it's hard to do a scale, but this is about a 2-inch gap here. I think the CTA, when they were modernizing this for Washington Park National Bank, they just covered over all the terracotta. So one of our priorities at Logan Square Preservation as we talk to the reuse and redevelopment of this site is to try and first explore and make sure that there's no historic material that's intact under there. That's among the many things we do for the neighborhood. And I'll flip through these fast because we're losing time, but this is the Chicago Norski Club. Again, another sort of forgotten site. I talked to a lot of people. It's now a condo building today. I talked to a lot of people there, and they would market it as for real estate or whatever as the Norwegian consulate, but of course it was nothing of the kind. It was a fraternal society. They had a ladies' auxiliary, of course, as well. But, as is only right. But this building was actually designed by a team Guyver and Dinkelbert, who did the Jewelers building downtown. They also did the structural steel for the Statue of Liberty. And even, we found all of that, Logan Square Preservation found all of that out before the developer mucked it up, and we still couldn't convince Vilma Colomb to pressure this guy into saving the building. But it once had, it was all artist created, installed. So you see, this is the high seat, and this is a mural of Leif Erikson discovering North America, which of course, the Norwegians are quite proud of that. This is the King of Norway, actually, when he came and visited Logan Square. I thought I'd give you guys a sense. Now, what's funny about this is these are now 2 condo units. If you look at this hall, this is one of 2 rooms. On this side, it was the high seat. On the other side, you had the fireplace with these are actually like gargoyle type faces. The fireplace is now next to somebody's kitchen. It's a really odd condo conversion. A lot of the original material remains, but everything that was artistic. So, the mural back here and the carved seats and everything, it actually went to a museum in Iowa for the Norwegian diaspora. I'm going to hand it off to Jacob to talk to you a little bit about this little bit of forgotten infrastructure.
Yes. Thank you, Andy. So we thought we would wrap things up here. There's so much more to talk about, and please, everybody, buy the book if you don't have it already, because there's a lot in there, of course. And I love the fact that Andy's still finding all this great material. Right after the book came out. I think there's going to have to be a part 2, probably, but that always happens with these projects. But in any event, we thought this kind of encapsulates the way that the neighborhood has changed over time, and how some things are. While some things have changed, some issues and controversies still remain the same. So this is the east end of the neighborhood, of course, at the corner of Western and Logan Boulevard, which is now pretty much buried under the Kennedy Expressway. But this intersection, interestingly, has always been a mess. And it's been a mess because in the early days, the Chicago Northwestern Railroad chose this route following, essentially the Chicago River and Elston Avenue northwest, straight shot north, since the 1850s, I believe. And so this was always an issue where it crossed some streets at weird angles. So the Chicago Northwestern Railroad crosses Western Avenue right where Logan Boulevard comes in and creates this very awkward intersection. It's still awkward today. And so this is it's a plan from, what was this, from about 1927 to try to figure out how to deal with this intersection, which was, again, you have Western and Logan coming together right under this viaduct, kind of similar to how it still does today. And the interesting thing is just, you look at it up here, it's a little hard to see, but the massive amount of pillars that there were, blocking views and everything, and people were turning. And so this was the solution, essentially, was to build this new viaduct. And it really was not that much of an improvement, I would argue, because by the 1970s, the city replaced that viaduct again with another viaduct that has less pillars, but it's still an insanely dangerous intersection. And of course, the Kennedy Expressway comes through around 1960 and creates a whole other era of or layer of complication. But it's just an interesting story about how this one particular intersection has pretty much always been a mess. And you can kind of see down here, some of the construction. And this is actually a shot of the. This is the construction of the expressway right at the bottom. So this is construction of the Kennedy Expressway from the late 1950s. Again, it would open in 1960 as the Northwest Expressway. But again, this is here's a larger view of it. This is the east end of the neighborhood, and again, just shows how much the expressway really transformed the eastern part of Logan Square. So again, this shot shows you just the amount of demolition that happened for the expressway. Obviously, it follows the Chicago Northwestern Railroad tracks. So in some ways, it was a less harmful, one would say, a routing than running it right through the center of the neighborhood. But still, it required the demolition of a lot of stuff. And here's Western Avenue, of course, and this is that terrible intersection right under these railroad tracks before the city replaced this viaduct again in the 1970s. And of course, still an issue today because there's a whole controversy going on now about how to get bikes through this intersection. So this has been a mess for a long time. Some things never change. And also interesting in different changes in infrastructure, which I always find very fascinating. At Forgotten Chicago, we just love discovering the history of the city's infrastructure, because it's a lot of it's not necessarily it's not ancient history by any means, but it's changed so much even in the past 40 or 50 years. So when the Kennedy Expressway or Northwest Expressway was built, one of the things that it ended up doing was cutting off a lot of the neighborhood from St. John Birchman's Church. So a lot of the parishioners of St. John Birchman's right along Logan Boulevard live north of the expressway, and a lot of them walk to church. So one of the solutions that the city came up with was let's put a pedestrian tunnel under the expressway at Campbell to allow those people to still attend church. Worked fine for a while, and then, of course, the tunnel became a haven for crime, and there were muggings and things like that. So eventually the city closed this tunnel. I want to say in the 1980s. We never were able to find the exact time the city walled off this tunnel. And when the city rebuilt the expressway completely in 1995, all evidence of this is mostly gone. But one time there was a pedestrian tunnel under the Kennedy Expressway to kind of connect the neighborhood a little more, which would be nice if we still had it for bikes, which is funny. If this still existed, it would come in handy for getting through that intersection. So, and this is just one more shot, kind of a last shot at looking east on Logan Boulevard towards Western Avenue. So, heading towards that intersection. And the one other interesting thing that I think is fascinating that's now gone, that I had no idea was even once there was a little slip ramp that allowed you to get from Logan Boulevard going east to Western Avenue south without going under the viaduct first. It went right along the expressway here. And we can't exactly find when that was closed off. Definitely it disappeared with the reconstruction of the expressway in 95. And you can kind of see parts of it here when the expressway is under construction. I think it's a dog park now.
It's the dog park.
Yeah. But just interesting, again, how this intersection has evolved over time just in this one little place. And obviously still a mess to this day. So
What a note.
with that being said, thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. And please buy our book. And we'd love to take any questions if anybody has questions. We've got a few minutes for that. So thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, how did everybody find out about this great program?
Twitter.
Twitter,
Facebook, Twitter? Good.
Yes.
Yes.
That Maplewood mansion, the color card.
Yeah, the colorized photograph.
Is there any chance that was that same house that a few minutes before that you were talking about, that mansion?
No, I
Powell,
don't.
or-
Yeah, no, I don't think so. That was
That had a tower.
it had a different, but the tower arrangement was actually it was slightly different. But good thought. Yes.
Some of these old photographs always strike me as so strange that, they're out in the middle of the country and that this little bit looks so urban. And I'm looking at one of them, it struck me, you've got the dirt road, you've got the house, maybe stone or whatever, and the park, a sidewalk and the parkway. The Chicago characteristic, even out here in the sticks, then, people were doing that.
Part of that was being driven by the way that the lots were being subdivided too. So when the Powells subdivided their land, they were subdividing it into 25 by 125 lots. And then you had, just like today, there's a few architects that come up with a few good ideas for how to develop something on a particular site, and then it gets replicated over and over and over again. People copy what was done before, especially when you're imagining that the city is going to grow and expand out this way. Yes.
Andrew, I was going to mention that part of the reason why the Northwest is that there was an Indian trail that went up that way.
That is true.
And one of the little stories comes that the Kimballs, he met a wolf walking down that one day. So
Yeah,
that's part of where the original diagonal came from.
Yeah, that's true. Alan here was mentioning that the Milwaukee Avenue, there were all these records about, this was an Indian trail and that was an Indian trail, and there were the Indians, the Native Americans rather, they would follow those higher patches of ground, and Milwaukee Avenue was one of those higher patches of ground. The story he's referencing about Martin Kimball, which is always kind of an amazing one to think of, is he actually he did have to contend with wolves out here, which is, we did have the coyote, we had the mountain lion once. Everybody remember the mountain lion in Roscoe Village? Cops gunned that thing down. But no, none of us has had to contend with a wolf, but the wolf actually drove Mr. Kimball into his woodshed, so it must have been hard living for sure. Yes?
So how do we become members
Ah.
of Logan Square Preservation?
That's a suspicious question. You can join Logan Square Preservation in the back of the room. You can also join it online at logansquarepreservation.org. We're always looking for volunteers and for people to get active. We're a friendly group of people, except when we're not. And it's certainly a lot of people that are very passionate about this community that make up Logan Square Preservation. So you should consider joining us. If you're here, you already have an interest, you should think about it. Yes, and then 2, 3.
someone else.
Okay, yes.
So I just heard once that Milwaukee Avenue actually was a toll road that went out to Milwaukee.
Yes, and this is when we get into, like, it's so hard to try and cover absolutely everything. Milwaukee Avenue was a toll road, so the state granted a franchise. Actually, I discovered from reading this, they originally granted it to several landowners who then paid to grade and ditch Milwaukee Avenue, and then those landowners sold it to another person who then, the Northwest Plank Road Company, who came in and actually did wood planks. The construction of that is actually fascinating. If you can picture how a staircase is built with the two stringers, right? What they actually did on Milwaukee Avenue was run two long stringers, and then they set these enormous 16-foot long oak planks down right on top of the stringers. Kimball actually built several miles of the road. But the thought was, well, these planks are so enormous, nothing will move them, so we'll just leave them here. We won't attach them to the stringers. We'll just set them in place. And so what, of course, happened is they got wet. They warped in the sun. Heavy wagons would go over them. They'd pop off. People would actually go out to the road and take them away to build their own whatever they're going to build. So the road got really, really bad. And they still had the toll gates, and the toll gate was enormously profitable. I mean, it was a millionaire that owned it. I mean, he was actually murdered. Whether he was murdered over it is something else. But it was so loathed that in 1889, just prior to annexation, a whole bunch of people that lived around it got drunk is the story, but they all dressed up like Native Americans, like Indians, and they descended on the toll booth in the night and they burned it. So, and then no one would give the toll booth permission to be reconstructed, and so there was no more toll booth. Yes.
My question's about you said that people wanted to come out here because they didn't have to build houses in brick because it wasn't the city of Chicago. But 1890 was when?
1889.
89. Yeah. So in that 20-ish, 5-ish years, did a lot of those frame houses burn down?
No, you should go down. Well, I think we've seen a lot of them demolished, but you should actually go down some of those streets, particularly the ones that are close to Western. You'll see Artesian and Campbell, Rockwell. You'll see a lot of new construction homes over there, brick ones, and they all replaced older frame buildings. And the old frame buildings, many of them are still there. Logan Boulevard has an enormous number of frame buildings. We lost several very large frames that were on double lots. People built a lot of frames around here, and there's a lot. They made it. A lot of them made it. A lot of them didn't. But
and workers' cottages too? Wasn't that a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we describe what constitutes a workers' cottage, it's kind of a fluid definition. So I think that you make a workers' cottage out of. In fact, Matt Bergstrom could probably speak to that very well. Matt, who's sitting there, he's a Logan Square Preservation member. He's done an enormous and fabulous project on Lyndale, which is actually on exhibit here in the library right now. You should check it out when you get a chance. But
when's Matt going to come talk about that?
Well, that's another question. Matt, are you coming to talk about that project?
Yeah, he's coming.
December 6th, Matt Bergstrom will be here to talk about it.
Today.
But
Today, the same day your books would be due if you checked out today.
I love libraries.
Matt's come up with a zine too about his project, and we've got a few copies to hand out. So please be sure to pick one up.
Yeah, his zine is really fabulous, and he's done a great project there. Matt deserves a round of applause for that. In fact, 1, 2.
I'm curious. Boulevards, they come in like 1909, or they were planned in.
No, the boulevards were authorized during a big authorization of the West and North and South Parks districts. That was 1869, and that was when they started being planned. But in the late 1800s is really when the boulevards were constructed in earnest. That's when they were planted. And so you'll see a lot of photos, like when we get around to 1906, all the trees are in place, the curbs, the roadways themselves, but there's no houses. The boulevards themselves, you could actually argue, and many have, that they were simply a real estate speculation scheme, because it was real estate people that lobbied the state to authorize them. And the idea was, hey, come out of the madding crowd, the crushing press of the city where it's dirty and noisy and terrible. Come out by the boulevards, it's beautiful out here.
I thought it was part of the plan of Chicago, so
it was part of the plan of Chicago too. It was included in there, but it was authorized way back in the 1869. Yes?
These may be overly simplistic questions for this crowd, so feel free to answer me later if they're not relevant. But I have 2 questions. One of them is, how do you understand the relationship between Avondale and Logan Square? Because I understand that stretch of Milwaukee where they're doing construction used to be considered Logan Square, but like now it's Avondale or something like that. And then my other question is, My understanding is the neighborhood identified as Bucktown, but then a group of realtors decided to rename it Logan Square because of the centennial statue. So can you clarify some of that for me?
Sure. So
or answer later?
No. Sure. Those are good questions. Logan Square was Logan Square only. It was, and you'll see it repeatedly used in different contexts. I mean, the way we talk about our neighborhoods in Chicago is very amorphous. So when you talk about Avondale, and Jacob can speak to this a little bit, but or a lot really. But I talked about Maplewood, right? And Maplewood was a farming community. Avondale was another. Humboldt was another. Holstein, which is where Bucktown and Holstein Park is today, was another. And those names have survived to varying degrees to our time. But Logan Square, the Logan Square district, what we've come to think of it as, it was really created as a center after the 1895 extension of the Metropolitan Elevated out here. That was when Logan Square became the real sort of beating heart of the neighborhood. And then when the city, I would sort of argue that when the city created the community areas is when people that might have lived in a place called, in fact, if you're interested, I have something here where there's a young lady who named Sarah Smith who wrote Memories, and this is about, she moved into the neighborhood in 1900, spring of 1900, and she was told they were coming to Logan Square, and then she kind of complains bitterly that they were living on Springfield, and that was Pennock, which is a whole other, the Healy Stop was once Pennock, it was another community, but she complains, of course, that Pennock was a little more lowbrow. They wanted to live in Logan Square, and so, the way we talk about place names is, maybe you want to speak to Avondale.
Yeah, especially because I also co-authored the book on Avondale, shameless plug, which I don't have here tonight, but you can find it in many places, including online. But in any event, interestingly, so Avondale is a much older, I would argue, community than Logan Square. Avondale grew up around the Avondale train station, which was once on Belmont and Kedzie, where the Kennedy Expressway goes over that intersection now. There was a train station there. So Avondale, Maplewood, these were all kind of suburbs that right before the city developed, that were little communities that were on the outskirts. Whereas Logan Square was much more, I would say, a real estate. Well, they're both real estate developments.
It was the square. It was just
the square. And in terms of Bucktown is only kind of, I would argue, associated with Logan Square because for whatever reason, when the University of Chicago sociologists in the 1920s drew the community area map, which is basically what the city operates officially off of. This is passed through the city council, and this is the official, not really, they're called community areas, some people call them neighborhoods, but these are the official boundaries. Bucktown was drawn into Logan Square. So I'm not sure why that happened exactly. Bill, do you know?
It happened in part because the sociologists of the Chicago who were drawing those boundaries believed that there were like ecosystems. And so like major roads or railroad tracks would be used as boundaries for them, even if they weren't boundaries for the people who lived here.
There you go. But, these are always controversial. And again, Avondale is technically everything north of Diversey. So that stretch of Milwaukee you're talking about is in Avondale. And when we did the Avondale book, we were very specific on making Diversey the line. But a lot of people call areas north of Diversey Logan Square as well. But technically, it's Avondale. So,
I want to add, I read a marvelous thing which maybe helps explain this idea. And it is that it used to be that culture was defined by its center. And today we define it by its edges. So when we think of the United States of America, we picture the outline in our heads. But when a country like China says, "Well, we always ruled Tibet," what they really mean is Beijing was a center of power, right? And so where does China end? Where does Logan Square end? Where does Bucktown end? And it would sort of ebb and flow based on how people perceived those boundaries, where they thought the center of commerce and culture was. And at one time, it was Avondale. The train station up in Avondale was where all the business was. I've got pictures of it. Avondale was built. It doesn't look like it looked today, but it was built early. And Logan Square, what we think of as like the heart of Logan Square now, was prairie. But what happened when the L arrived, the L really supplanted the Chicago Northwestern as the commuter rail line, and that meant the cultural capital, like the big, heavy, the heavy place in the immediate vicinity became Logan Square. I hope that answers.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Oh.
Yes.
Why did those Powells, if they had all their streets and everything, they're not even represented? There's no street left? I mean, did they defend people?
Well, part of it is the grid. We have no.
Well, streets like Powell would have been the street name in this neighborhood, but farther south it was Campbell. And when the Brennan plan came through and convinced the city to standardize street names and create broken link streets that had the same name all the way through, if the street was shorter, it would lose out to a longer named street. So Campbell was south of here, and it was the name that they took for Powell and other. You see this all over the city. There was lots of street names that have disappeared because of this standardization.
And Bill's working on a book on that, by the way. Yes. So.
1909 was the beginning of the address system, but it took the street names started changing in 1900 and went through the 60s.
You can still see evidence of those changes here in the neighborhood. If you go down Albany, which is a lot of the home zone of the People's Republic of Albany between right over here. That was once called, it was connected up with Albany north and south. In fact, that changed in the 20s. It used to be that Albany didn't connect like it does through Kedzie, but it was called Catalpa Court. And so if you go down that street, you'll see a lot of the buildings, right? I think at least one or two actually have Catalpa carved into the building's lintels.
Because there was another Catalpa Street up in Andersonville,
that's right.
You couldn't have duplicated street names.
Right.
Somebody had to lose out.
Right.
Yep.
Yes.
I know north of the monument, east of the monument, all those had heavy German names. I heard they changed all the names with World War I.
There was a lot of that.
Or was it part of this renaming of the streets?
The renaming of the streets included the World War I renaming, but it's interesting that they changed names that were associated with Prussians. So the Bismarck School went away, Bismarck Street, Lubeck Street, streets named for German cities, but the streets named for German artists, Mozart, Goethe, Schiller, and so on, were left in part because Edward Brennan, who's the guy who got this all done on some level, argued that these people were not militarists and had done no harm to America. So they belong to the world. So we still have Mozart Street, but we don't have Bismarck.
Yeah, Bismarck School, in fact, he referenced,
Bismarck School was funded
Funston.
by the Polish American community right from the start in like 1914.
Yes, real.
Is there some place that you can find out the names of the people who played on the baseball?
If you're interested in that, I do have a list. I can
On my family quilt, there's a square with the baseball thing, and I'm like, I wonder if they played there or they just enjoyed it.
It's possible, for sure.
Okay.
Yes.
Also, in getting back to these German names, the big map of the neighborhood just north of the what do you call it, monument there, I believe they have all the German names on that map still, and they have, I think they got Logan Square named Palmer Square or something. The map is incorrect, but it's a beautiful map. Leave it as it is.
Well, I'll do my best to. I'll check it out and see what we're gonna do. Maybe I'll go out there with a paintbrush. Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I wanted to. We got a little quick list here. Thanks to certainly Shirley and all the staff at the Logan Square Library for hosting us. Yeah. Thanks to the Friends of the Logan Square Library. You should join them. Thanks to all the volunteers in Logan Square Preservation who work on this and who are working in the back to sell books and memberships. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Logan Square Preservation has a meeting now at the Minishirkin. Anybody who's interested in joining, we can go right up there. You can keep listening to us talk.